Okay. Uh, People are streaming into the attendance now. But I thought while people are entering the room, I thought I'd say a few things about housekeeping. So you have arrived at the Open Research Trust in Science and the Transparency Paradox panel. So welcome. This event is being recorded, and we do plan to share it online on LSE channels and perhaps elsewhere afterwards. The session will be 1 hour, and that's going to be about 35 to 40 minutes of panel discussion, followed by a sort of interactive thing where we'll take questions from you. So start preparing your questions. There's a Q&A option in the Zoom room. So we'd ask you to please use the Q&A to ask your questions. Uh, Now this is the scholarship. This is an exciting festival. It was UCL, and last year it was a collaboration with LSE and the Francis Crick Institute. There's 13 institutions across London that are participating. And this particular event, as you guys think backgrounds, it's organized by LSE. This is the Open Research Working Group, ORWG, which is a relatively new thing at LSE that organized this panel. It's a really cool group. It's a group of researchers, academics, professional services staff across LSE who are interested in the sort of strategic direction for open research at LSE. They're trying to foster a culture of open, transparent, inclusive, collaborative research. And well, if you'd like to know more about this remarkable group, if you Google the LSE Library YouTube channel, you'll find other events like these, and you can watch them. It's very interesting, sort of big picture thinking about open research in the LSE and beyond. So with that sort of housekeeping, let's start the panel. So hello. In recent years, there have been calls for ever more openness to research, to make science visible and transparent, and that public trust will follow. But as you might know, trust itself is a rather intricate concept. Of course, trust, one might aim at trust by adopting some transparency, and this can signal things like rigor and integrity. But it can also expose the untidy nature of human inquiry, the parts of our inquiries that are provisional, and the deeply, in the end, human character of research, all of which can unsettle trust. This tension between trust and transparency, which we might call the transparency paradox, invites us really to ask, how should we best communicate science? Do we earn trust by showing the full machinery of research, or by presenting its polished conclusions only? What, in the end, should the public image of science be? Should it be a finished edifice or a work perpetually under construction? These are the questions we're going to ask today and more. My name is Bryan Roberts. I'm a professor of philosophy, logic, and scientific method here at the LSE, and I'm chairing this panel. And here with me today are three scholars of open science. Dr. Tamarind Haven is an assistant professor in the Department of Methodology and Statistics at Tilburg University. Byron Hyde is of the Center for Ethics in Medicine at University of Bristol and the School of History, Law, and Social Sciences at Bangor University. And Dr. Richard Williams is a postdoc researcher in the Department of Science, Technology, and Society at the Technical University of Munich. So to launch us off, Tamarind, would you like to have a start and tell us a bit about your research on open science and trust?
I would love to. Thanks, Brian. So, my work has very much in recent years focused around the question, how is science done most effectively? And what kind of improvements can be made? And I say my work, but I should note that the paper I'm going to be mostly drawing on today was a collaborative project. So people should also really take note that this was written with different co-authors. Now, if you care, like me, about science being done in a manner that's effective and that makes good usage of the resources and the taxpayer money that it gets, then it's also important that we don't unnecessarily duplicate any efforts. And something we have noticed is that various communities nowadays are, if you will, guardians of science. There's many, many of us actually that care about doing research effectively. And something we have noted is that increasingly, the more of us coming on board to be those guardians and stewards of good science, the more difficult it became to really know is this relevant, or is this contribution that I want to make something that is already being done or not? And to make matters even worse, we started to see efforts being duplicated. And that's, of course, not good if you care about science being effective. So we decided to write a piece targeting three different communities that typically use three different kinds of concepts or conceptual repertoires to showcase, hopefully, that despite maybe the concepts that they draw on having a different focus, that we ultimately care about the same thing and that it might be worthwhile to pay slightly more attention to one another's work. And that can sometimes be difficult because, as many people in this call know, it can already be difficult to keep up with developments in your own field. And we're even encouraging you to keep up with developments in a different field. And for that, we had to do a little bit of argumentation. So, something that we said is, again, if you care about science being done efficiently and effectively, then something we think we are all aiming for is making sure that research is traceable. We actually know where findings are coming from, and then it's also verifiable, that we can vet the trust, if you will, or the rigor underneath the scientific findings that are being presented. And that actually means there's different sort of parameters that we would like to be in place. And one community that I originally come from is more of the research integrity community. So if you look at science from a research integrity perspective, you are also very interested in things and making sure that things are not done in a sloppy manner, right? Because if they would ultimately be done in a sloppy manner, where the most sloppy or erroneous thing would be actually coming up with your own findings without them being grounded in any evidence, then it makes sense to actually invest also thoroughly in making sure that researchers and scholars adhere to what we call responsible research practices. And something that we argue for in the paper is that these responsible research practices are actually behaviors that researchers can engage in to help ensure that the quality and trustworthiness of one's research is up to scratch. And what they have in common is that they focus on the way that research is being conducted. So examples could be that you actually apply validated measurements when you want to, measure something as fuzzy as trust. Then you want to really make sure that you know what you are measuring. An additional thing could be that you actually consult with statisticians if you are up to doing slightly more complicated analyses, and so on. Another thing that is really important if we care about, again, science being verifiable and traceable is transparency. And transparency, as we've also seen here, has been a buzzword that already unites some communities. And we argue in the paper that transparency is something that has a unique focus on reporting research in the most effective way. So, reporting how a study was or will be conducted by, for example, writing up a detailed research protocol before the start of the study and reporting all its results afterwards. And we've also seen open notebooks, for example, in pre-registrations. And finally, another big, big community that unites many of us is, of course, the open science and the open research community. And I want to say from the get-go, I know that that's very much an umbrella term. But when it comes to what researchers actually can do to make their work more traceable and verifiable, a big part of open science focuses on how research output is being disseminated. And open science therein has also broadened the traditional interpretation of what actually counts as research output. And proponents of open science often also argue for openly sharing the data underlying the results, or openly sharing the methods or the code that have been used to create these results, openly sharing protocols and depositing those in relevant repositories, and so on. And interestingly, these three different concepts, so the responsible research practices, the transparency, and the open science, they're all come together. But that also means that it can actually be different cases where one of them is lacking. And we can clearly see if we look into some of those cases that science is then not done in a way that actually makes it verifiable and trustworthy. So there can be an example where research is fully open. So a very example here would be a paper is openly accessible. Everyone can download it from everywhere in the world, regardless of their institution. And it can also be that it is very transparent. Maybe it's pre-registered with a full study protocol and it also shares its data. But if those data have ultimately been collected in a sloppy way, maybe not using an actual good instrument, having a very low sample size, reporting irrelevant outcomes, or maybe assessing pseudo outcomes rather than real things, then it's still not really something that helps us getting trust in the research that's being conducted. And maybe slightly similarly, it can also be that a study has actually applied all those rigorous methods, right? It was adequately blinded, it was well powered, it used validated measures, and it's been transparently reported, but is not openly accessible, meaning that there's many scholars and researchers, and maybe even a general public around the world, that if they would be interested in it, they wouldn't have access. And that would ultimately slow down even the progression of knowledge. And finally, it can of course be that work is rigorously conducted and openly accessible, but if it's not really transparently reported, then we still don't actually know what's being done. And this can again hamper the ultimate progression of knowledge and doing that in an efficient and effective way. So we argue that these communities should pay a closer look at the work that the others are conducting, because ultimately these three ingredients are needed if we care about strengthening trust in research and researchers. Now, I want to say one final thing before handing over to my wonderful other very clever panelists here, and that is when reading your work and thinking about my own work, something I noted is that perhaps, and I'll say it out loud here, I've been a little bit too inward looking. Our paper, in a way, is very much about the trust that researchers should have in other researchers. Because if that already is not happening, then where are we going to go? And I think that holds for every community. So, to take an example from a completely different world, um, I also want, for example, photocopy repair agents to be able to trust one another's work, to use one another's knowledge from everywhere in the world. Um, but I haven't necessarily thought about their best way of then communicating what's wrong with my photocopier to me. So, with that, I look forward to learning how that can be done better. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Next, we'll go to Byron Hyde. Please take it away.
There we go. Thank you very much. Let me just share this here. Fantastic. Hopefully everyone can see that. Someone please do shout if you can't, but I'll assume that you all can. So today we're talking about a paper that I wrote recently and attracted quite a lot of public attention. Actually, I spoke on a number of radio stations about it. A lot of the public were very interested, some of them quite concerned. That there appears to be evidence that lying can increase trust in science. So what you've just heard from Tamarind is, I suppose, what we think of as the classical view. Now, theorists and policymakers, anybody who thinks about trust and transparency intuitively, is going to come to the conclusion that transparency is going to increase trust in science. Transparency naturally makes science a lot more trustworthy. Open science is better science. I think we can all agree on that. It reveals that scientists are following scientific norms. It enables replication attempts. If we don't know the data that you're using to come to your conclusions, we can't test that again. We can't check that you're making proper inferences, deriving proper conclusions from that data. We're uncertain about the quality of your research when we don't know about it. Furthermore, the public has, from a more ethical, political philosophy kind of view, they have what's called a right to an explanation. So not only is open science methodologically better, but it's politically and morally superior as well. All of this makes open science a lot more trustworthy, and we would think that what's a lot more trustworthy would be more trusted. Now, the theorists, and when I say theorists, I'm talking here about philosophers, bioethicists, a lot of the kinds of people who have started to take interest in trust in science, people like myself, more often than not, particularly since the pandemic, we often think of trust in terms of trustworthiness, but we all agree that in principle, trust and trustworthiness are not the same. Just because I think that you're trustworthy doesn't actually make you trustworthy. If I think you're trustworthy, what that means is that I trust you. The public might trust science when it's not trustworthy, or they might distrust science when it is trustworthy. There's evidence that transparency can actually decrease trust in science. Around 50% of US physicians are paid by the biomedical industry. And in 2010, they were required to disclose this fact to all of their patients and to the public in something called the Physician Payments Sunshine Act. So the assumption is that by shining some sunshine on the conflicts of interest that these physicians have, things that are potentially making them um, not so good at what they're doing, that people would trust their physicians more by being transparent, by being open and honest about their potential weaknesses. The public should trust them a lot more. We're ending this long-standing practice of secrecy within the American Academy and within American medicine. Since then, a reduction in trust has been observed in American physicians. In part, this is caused by a problem that philosophers call the problem of over-idealizing science. The public have a naive view of science. They think that science should have no conflicts of interest. They think that science should be perfect. They think that science makes no mistakes. Science achieves the truth. There's an interesting test done, particularly in the US since I think the 1970s, 1980s, called the Draw a Scientist test, where they originally gave them to high schoolers and children, but they've since done it with a number of groups where people will be asked to, what does a scientist look like? Draw a scientist. What are their characteristics? They often draw a handsome white gentleman with spectacles, a bit older in his years, very intelligent fellow who makes no mistakes. And this is what the public think the scientist, the typical scientist, looks like. This became really quite acute in ClimateGate. So in the UK in particular, in 2009, the Climactic Research Unit at the University of East Anglia was hacked, and about 1,000 emails and 2,000 documents were leaked to the public. Pretty standard stuff, standard email correspondence between scientists, but there were certain phrases, among 2,000 documents that were picked out, phrases like hide the decline, and all of a sudden they were on the front pages of newspapers. This was such a scandal, in fact, that it prompted formal investigations into the Climactic Research Unit at University of East Anglia, but also into climate science more broadly by governments all over the world, including the United States Congress, including our own Houses of Parliament. All of these investigations revealed absolutely no misconduct. It was science as normal. This is simply what peer review looks like. However, the effect on trust in science remained obvious. Most publics didn't trust climate science as much as they did before ClimateGate. The reason for this, and this is a quote here from the journal Nature, which has an excellent journalistic section at the front, the public holds peer review as a revered gold standard of scientific excellence. So when they see peer reviewers and scientists talking about how to dismiss each other's objections and how to deal with different arguments and whatnot, that looks to them like scientific misconduct. This produces what I've called the transparency paradox, where transparency both increases and decreases trust in institutions. There is empirical evidence that by being transparent in certain contexts, trust in institutions does in fact increase. This is not a silly assumption that the theorists, that philosophers have, that by being more trustworthy, by being transparent, that people will trust us more. But the problem is, there's also empirical evidence of the opposite, that by being transparent, trust in institutions declines. This is the paradox that we have to deal with. The way that I try to answer it is by being a little bit more specific about what exactly it is that we're being transparent about. And by answering that, that could help us dissolve this paradox. Well, there are broadly speaking, two different things that we're being transparent about, which I call good news and bad news. When we're being transparent about what a good researcher I'm being. Here's all my data. Here's all the rigorous research that I've been doing, 10 years worth of information and research. And I'm transparent about all of that as part of open science practices. Here are my replication studies. Here is my pre-registration, all of that. That's good news. That looks excellent. People are likely going to trust me a lot more. But when I'm transparent about all the payments I'm receiving from industry, all of the messy data that I've tried to draw some sketchy inferences from, my p-values, my statistical inferences, which are just at the threshold of what I'm allowed to get away with the rules of science, that's not good news. That's bad news. And unsurprisingly, the public are probably not going to trust it as more. Now, I argue that lying, arguably, would solve this problem to the extent that science is really imperfect. There's a lot of bad news. As I said, 50% of US physicians have a financial conflict of interest. During the replication crisis about 15 years ago, only 40% of really quite significant research could be reproduced. This is a really quite big replication studies done by the Open Science Collaboration. It was done on psychology, it was done on cancer biology, there were replication studies done on economics, all of these really big major findings, pillars of modern science. And the vast majority of it couldn't be reproduced. We don't have as much good news as we'd like in science. When I'm faced with this kind of problem, I really, as a scientist, I have three options. I can either, if we think about the context of conflicts of interest, for example, I can reveal my fat list of conflicts of interest to you. You're probably not going to trust me very much. I can conceal my conflicts of interest. I simply just don't tell you. I abstain. This is the anti-open science point of view, I suppose. Make some weird excuse about privacy or something like that. Probably going to look like a relatively sketchy individual. You're probably going to lose trust in me as well. Or the third option is I achieve the appearance of honesty, and you're therefore more likely to trust me. And I reveal good news and say I have no conflicts of interest. The problem, of course, being that I do, and I'm lying about the good news that I have. Of those three options, only that third option, when I have the bad news, only lying about that bad news, is going to let me get away with maintaining public trust. The public think that science is perfect, so let's let it be perfect. Now, I call this a pseudo solution to the transparency paradox. I don't really advocate for this, despite the controversial title of my paper. The real cause of the transparency paradox is not bad news. It's the problem of the public over-idealizing science. It's that the public don't understand what to expect from science, and they don't know how to handle the bad news when they find out about it. This causes the public to lose trust despite us being more trustworthy with open science practices. So the solution is simply to get rid of that underlying problem of the public over-idealizing science, to improve our science education, to improve science communication, so that the public understands science a bit better. The problem, of course, is that scientists tend to pass the buck here. For example, in response to ClimateGate, the US National Academy of Sciences wrote a letter to the journal Science complaining that the public don't understand science and that all citizens should understand some scientific facts, including that there's uncertainty associated with scientific conclusions. Of course, the National Academy of Sciences had taken no such steps to ensure that the public actually knew any of that. This requires a lot of work on behalf of scientists, and in fact, we've been aware that this requires work for a long time. In this country, the Royal Society published a report in 1985, I think it was, entitled Public Understanding of Science. There's now a journal called Public Understanding of Science, and this report predated that by even 30 years. So before the formal study of public understanding of science, the Royal Society had published a report saying essentially what I've said here, which is that public need to understand the way that science works if they're to understand the role of uncertainty and if they're to maintain trust in science when the science doesn't look so perfect. Thank you very much. I'm now going to hand over to our third speaker, I think.
Yes, great. Thank you. So now on to you, Richard.
Thank you. Just give me 1 second. I'm just going to share slides. I've managed to swap my laptop. Okay. So, sorry, it's not letting me share. Lucy, do you mind showing my slides for me?
Is that working?
I've got it. Lovely. Great. Thank you. So each bullet point comes up with a click. So I'll just say next or click. And then if you could click on my behalf, that'd be great. Thank you. Okay. So I'm very broadly sympathetic to Byron Hyde's case, but I'm going to try to develop a third alternative that complements his account. And this is an account of knowledge intermediaries. Next. Okay, so we have this methodology that philosophers are going to care about, which is how should we think or approach science? And I'm very broadly sympathetic to Hyde's account. Next. So we have an idealistic view next. And this is that high ideals, abstract ideas of transparency, reproducibility can motivate better science. Next. And this is because even if these high ideals are what political philosophers might call hopeless, i.e., we are never going to fully implement them, we should nevertheless aspire to, because we can get closer and partially achieve them, even if we can never fully achieve them. Next. And so what we get is better science. On the other hand, if we have realistic ideals that take some of the ugly facts of science as just baked in or priced into science, then we're somehow being complacent about the status quo. Next. That there is an is-ought distinction, just how science is practiced isn't how it ought to be practiced. Next. And that our oughts or shoulds are constrained by what we can do, but not necessarily what we will do. There's lots of things that we are doing that we shouldn't, lots of things that we're not doing that we should. Okay, next. Next. However, I think that we should have a realistic approach, that this idealistic methodology in the background is causing problems. Next. And that is that these high ideals risk unintended consequences in specific situations. Next. That if an idea is hopeless, that they undercut public trust in science. So I completely agree with Hyde on this. Next. That it's true that ought implies can. Next. But promises imply will. Next. And if you don't live up to your ideals because they're hopeless, then broken promises undercut trust. Next. And so realistic ideals need to take responsibility for the likely but unintended consequences, such as breaks in public trust. Next. If we have more realistic ideals that are achieved, then they're seen as promises kept, and that will help to promote trust in science, or at least avoid the erosion from breaking promises. Next. But which agent is primarily responsible for making the promises and showing that the promises are kept? Next. That we have this paradox that Hyde has very nicely explained. Next. And we have two main agents. So one is to put the social responsibility on experts, and they can lie through omission by downplaying or keeping quiet the bad news, lies by omission. But this obviously compromises the integrity of experts. Next. Or we could educate citizens. But one problem with educating citizens is it may overburden citizens, that citizens are busy. If you think of your own to-do list, right? And now, number 10 is you now have to learn Science 101 or Social Science 101, Econ 101. It's very busy. Time's a scarce resource, and there's significant opportunity costs in adding this burden onto the shoulders of citizens. Next. And so with a richer social epistemology, we might start looking for if there's any other agent outside of experts and citizens who can bear or shoulder a bulk of this responsibility. And I argue that there is a third one, a neglected third agent. Next. Knowledge intermediaries. Next. Okay, so we have what I call the transmission gap, and this is where knowledge intermediaries come in. Next. Where citizens don't receive information directly from scientists, they receive them through a web of intermediaries. The experts produce scientific knowledge, and citizens consume or use scientific knowledge. But how does scientific knowledge get from the experts that produce it to the citizens that use it for various political and social ends? Well, the knowledge has to be transported or transmitted between the experts and the citizens, and the agents that do the transmission I call knowledge intermediaries. Next. So this is journalists, podcasters, think tanks, issue publics, and opinion leaders, that they don't have the skills of the experts, but they're not necessarily mere citizens, that they have special skills in transportation and information transmission. Next. And so what's important is that trust is not just lost and gained in knowledge production on the shoulders of experts. Trust can also be gained and lost in knowledge transmission. And so knowledge intermediaries are really important for trust and distrust in science. Next. Next. And so experts largely focus on knowledge production, that they are contributory experts, that they contribute novel findings within a specific discipline that requires very specific specialized epistemic labor. Next. And so they promote what we might call internal trust, information that other experts with those skills can trust. Next. But a knowledge intermediary is not primarily talking to other experts. They're talking to non-experts, to citizens. And so what they are trying to do is transmit information that experts trust to citizens who lack expert skills. Next. And so what they might be doing is trying to promote a different type of trust that we might call external trust, trust in expert judgment or produced information by non-experts. Next. Next. And so knowledge intermediaries develop very particular, specific, novice-orientated abilities to translate internally trusted information into externally trusted information. Next. And this is just because there's epistemic inequality between experts and citizens, that citizens lack the expertise that cutting-edge physicists, economists, social scientists, public health experts have. And so citizens cannot directly evaluate the research, that they can't tell if the data is good or not, and they can't tell if the methods applied are good or not, because they lack the credentialed expertise to do so. Next. What citizens tend to do is that they accept narratives and indirectly evaluate knowledge on non-expert markers of reliability. Next. And so what knowledge intermediaries do is develop novice-orientated abilities that help to align scientific information to the narrative-based concerns of specific publics. Does this information care about people like me? Was it produced with people like me in mind? Is this information taking away something that I value, such as, say, making social inequality worse? Is it taking away basic freedoms that I care about? And so on. Next. Next. And so the dichotomy between experts producing information on the one hand and citizens consuming information on the other overlooks intermediary responsibilities. Next. So rather than directly rejecting false beliefs, what knowledge intermediaries do is that they constantly revise and refine the dynamic narratives that are within public discourse in the knowledge ecosystem. Next. And what's really important about this is that against experts and having centralized messaging or an expert consensus is that contestation amongst rival intermediaries is self-correcting and therefore is more fluid in a way that if we have a fixed consensus, it's much harder to challenge. Next. Against the idea of having more science education is that science education tends to be quite general and generic, and the half-life of it, i.e. how long will people remember it, tends to be quite short, that even if people are highly informed afterwards, within 6 months, they might have forgotten half of it. Whilst what knowledge intermediaries can do is that they constantly revise and refine the naive view for science in light of specific social concerns of specific publics that follow them. Next. But we have a symmetry problem next. The bad intermediaries can spread misinformation just as much as good ones can spread the truth or reliable scientific information. Next. What can we do about this? So this is a genuine problem. Next. Is that robust contestation amongst knowledge intermediaries both catches lies and is self-correcting. Next. That against expert consensus, it might catch lies, but if expert consensus itself is very fixed, it's harder to correct or to revise or to reposition without contestation. Next. And also, contestation can give scientific information more public trust because it can survive the strongest objections. That what contestation by knowledge intermediaries does is that it gives expert consensus a push. And if it falls down, it shows that it was fragile. And if it stays standing, this gives us a non-expert reason to trust it, because if an expert consensus can survive the strongest contestation and still stay standing, it looks robust. Next. And so conclusion, next. So Hyde asks, what should we do when transparency destroys trust as one way of understanding the paradox? Next. And I think that an intermediary's answer can say that, well, scientists typically don't speak directly to specific publics, knowledge intermediaries do. Next. And so to complement the science education that Hyde advocates, and I suppose the strategic use of lying by omission, which is an interesting strategy, is to build and support a web of human intermediaries that can better translate, contest, and adapt trustworthy information in light of the narratives of particular publics and narrative-based concerns that they have. Next. And so what happens is that the knowledge intermediaries web promises to close the gap between trustworthiness independently of using, say, expert lies very judiciously or a generalized public education. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for getting us started. So a lot to talk about here. Some great questions already coming into the Q&A. So as a reminder to the audience, please do feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A box. Let me start with Tamarind. Your paper points out that transparency can often expose a lack of rigor. So from your perspective, is this, to what extent is this paradoxical, and to what extent is it just a correct response to an exposed lack of rigor?
So as I said, my work is very much focused on, increasing this trust in the research that's being conducted by other researchers. And in that specific context, again, in that more sort of inward looking context, or in what Richard just called internal trust, I don't think there's a paradox at all. I think we should expose that much, much more. However, when it then comes to taking that and communicating it to the public, we get into a much more messy territory, as Hyde has correctly pointed out.
Yes, so turning to Hyde, you've got a couple of the worst examples of sort of poor behavior in science in your article of the last 20 years. So you mentioned ClimateGate and of course the exposure of the conflicts of interest for US physicians. But your lesson was very general. It sort of suggested that the general public understanding of science should be adjusted. But to what extent is this paradox really coming from a couple of very specific examples of bad behavior? Are you suggesting that, over at CERN and, and in endless other areas of science, the exact same concerns arise? How general is this paradox?
So what these specific examples are supposed to illustrate is the fact that trust and trustworthiness have become unmoored from one another. They're not anchored to one another the way that we historically have assumed that they are. Now, obviously, with the more extreme examples, it's easier to illustrate these kind of precipitous declines in public trust. Now, public trust is something that's difficult to measure anyway. So, at the end of the day, I am a theorist. And so I am theorizing that the problem being that because people understand science in a certain way, and that understanding of science looks pretty good, and our evidence from that comes from things like the draw scientist test and empirical studies on over idealizing and things like that. So we have pretty good evidence that people think quite highly of science. And then every single time we have some kind of crisis, like the pandemic, like ClimateGate, like the Physician Payment Sunshine Act, that actually really exposes all of the inner workings of science, we then get a visible public decline in trust in science. So I'm theorizing that, this is a problem that exists under the surface all of the time. It flares up when we have crises like COVID. And so, optimistically, this is only a crisis disaster response problem. But realistically, I think it exists on an everyday basis. I suspect it exists between doctors and their patients. I think it exists between people watching the news and hearing about evidence-based policy on a regular basis. It might not be as problematic. It might not be as precipitous a decline on a daily basis, but I think it's a problem that does exist under the surface more broadly.
Great. And Richard, I wonder if you could say, I mean, sort of speaking to these issues about generality in different communities, Tamarind has helpfully identified how the community matters. And that sort of fed into your thinking as well, that there are these different layers of communication of science, very similar in spirit to what Tamarind argued. So how do you see the sort of the response that Hyde has given here, is it generic across the communities you've identified this problem, that something that can flare up in any of these communities, or is it something that is, we should be most concerned about at a certain community level, say the public level or the inter-researcher level?
Great. So I think the public is composed of very different and divergent publics. And so everything Hyde says, I agree with. I think that we just need an extra layer or to pay attention to knowledge intermediaries that can help to tailor and adapt generically reliable expert consensus, a generic science education to the specific problems that we face and the specific publics asking questions. And so, for example, using a COVID example, if you're particularly religious, you might really care about whether you can congregate or not. And this might not be a general concern, it's a specific concern. But if you have a knowledge intermediary that can explain the different trade-offs, explain the sort of theologically based concerns that you might have, and how this fits with the evidence, whether the evidence considered these, how it considered these, what other goods is it weighted against, then this can help to promote trust. When it comes to, say, radical publics or unreasonable publics, right, people who are embedded in conspiracy theories and worries like this, I think it's really important that science is a social enterprise, and if you're in a society that has publics with these concerns, that they are given a fair hearing. That doesn't mean that you agree with them. It doesn't mean that you give them weight to well evidence concerns, but it means that you do give some sort of response to them. And I think that knowledge intermediaries are particularly well equipped to do this precisely because they specialize in novice orientated abilities and how to speak to the publics that they attract as an audience. And so obviously this is not perfect, but I think that what they give you is a fluid response that can adapt when expert consensus tends to be quite fixed, and that they give you a specific response when science education tends to be quite general. And I think that that's very useful. Yeah.
Great. So let me turn this around a little bit. We've got a very nice question from Jason Harper in the Q&A box, who writes, does conflict of interest matter if science is reproducible and open? So if academic peers have trust in the findings and this is articulated to the public, does it really matter if that research was done, say, by a commercial chemist? So are these really instances that should lead to a failure of trust? Should we be, building a certain kind of trust with the public, or is it enough to have the right kind of trust by those who would check the rigor, to use Tamarind's language? Any of you, please feel free to comment.
Yeah, I can jump in on that. So I don't think conflicts of interest matter at all methodologically, and in fact, there's good research to show that all research is conflicted. I think often in the conversation about conflicts of interest, they often distinguish between industry funding and independent funding. You say, well, hang on a minute, what do you mean by independent funding? Oh, government funding. Ah, yes, because government doesn't have an agenda at all. Government, doesn't strike keywords out of National Institute of Health funding when the president changes or anything like that. So of course, there's no such thing as independent funding. Funding is funding, and there's good evidence that it goes both ways. Whoever you're funded by, there is a risk of influence that your findings are going to be influenced by who you're being funded by. So I don't think methodologically speaking, it's a big concern at all. I wouldn't, just because somebody has a conflict of interest, be saying, let's chuck this in the bin. And I think most methodologists agree with me that a conflict of interest is something to pay attention to. We have disclosure, but it's not something to start chucking people off of committees because they disclose a conflict of interest. The reason why we're concerned about it is because of the public understanding, because science operates on trust. If the public doesn't trust science, They won't follow public health recommendations. During the pandemic, for example, trust in institutions was a determinant of public health. People's willingness to get vaccinated, to comply with wearing masks, social distancing, directly correlated to their trust in institutions. That's science, government, and medicine. So, science literally operates on trust. People won't follow our recommendations, and I say most importantly to me, people won't fund science either. It comes from the taxpayer wallet. Science literally cannot exist without public trust, and so to that extent, we have to be concerned about conflicts of interest even if it doesn't actually have that much of a methodological effect on science. Whether we like it or not, science is part of society, and we have to adhere to some extent to the public opinion. If we don't want to do that, we need to change the public opinion. We can't simply say, well, the public's wrong. We'll get on with our own thing.
Yeah, Richard.
Oh, great. So I think the answer is going to be that it depends, and it particularly depends on the public. So conflicts of interest might not matter if you are a methodologist because you can rely on just looking directly at the quality of the research itself. But if you're a non-expert and you just lack that, then you do have to rely on other markers of reliability, and conflict of interest is one which everybody could understand. So, for example, if there's a conflict of interest, then this might give us a disposition or a bias against trusting it, which could be overcome by looking at the research itself and seeing that it's high quality. But if you're a citizen without the expertise, then you do need to rely on these other markers. And so it depends. So if you're talking to other experts, it might not matter very much because we can just jump straight to the methodological debate. But if you're wanting a non-expert public to trust it, then I think it does become very important precisely because the priority of expert markers of reliability and non-expert markers of reliability depend on whether it's an expert or non-expert public that you're wanting to trust it.
And yes, Tamron, did you want to get in as well?
Yes, please. Because I think we also have an epistemic reason for caring about these conflict of interest statement, and particularly because we have relatively solid empirical evidence that people and scientists in this case being funded by, for example, the fat industry used incredibly rigorous, very transparent and open methods to showcase that sugar was horrible. And it was getting away. So it was sort of deliberately using the science to redirect the public attention, right? So I think many of us in the 90s grew up with thinking, but fat is horrible. And that was massively pushed by sugar industry hiring scientists to do incredibly rigorous work. So I actually do think we also have an epistemic reason for caring about conflict of interest statements.
Yes, fascinating. So, I mean, this is coming back around again now to the proposal for Hyde's original proposal for more public understanding. And perhaps combining a little bit now with Richard's suggestion for intermediaries. I'm interested in what those intermediaries look like, and I think a lot of people in this audience seem to as well. There are, for example, some library experts in the audience and in the questions box. And one of them asks, what are the role for librarians? What do these intermediaries look like within the universities? Do they exist in the universities? So those people who should be charged with improving public understanding of science. Hyde sort of suggested, well, the American Academy of Science let pass the buck to someone else. But whose responsibility is it really? Where should we find these intermediaries? Should we be worried about them being bad actors? So comments on what these intermediaries look like. Perhaps we could start with Richard if you have a comment.
Great, yeah. So this is a really interesting question. So this is a work in progress. So I don't have sort of fully refined answers. So what I would say is, first of all, I'm skeptical of like grand theories. So I don't really want to say a knowledge intermediary is X, and if you're not X, then you're not it. I think it's going to be case by case. So an expert, as I understand them, contributes novel research in a particular field or discipline. And then a citizen is or a layperson is just using information for a particular social or political goal. And so if you're taking information from an expert to a citizen, if you're in this transmission process, then I would happily count you as a knowledge intermediary. And so librarians would absolutely be included in this, as would data curation, as would science communication, as would an expert themselves when they're acting in a role as an intermediary. And so, as for all sort of social categories, it's fuzzy, it's context dependent, but librarians would absolutely be there. And it's not necessarily that librarians will need to make decisions because not for big capital P, political reasons or partisan reasons, but I'm sure that within libraries, within every other institution, that there's an internal politics, an internal dynamic, that there's a certain set way of doing things, there's path dependencies. And so the information that they make more available or more visible compared to the ones that they don't, well, this might make a difference to the sort of information that students and other library users can access or not access. And this does make a difference to people's information base, evidence base. That makes a difference to the sorts of views they're going to form and so on. So absolutely, that I would definitely include librarians in knowledge intermediaries.
Yeah, Tamarind, did you have a thought about this?
The only thing I had to think of was that maybe also it's the what I understood at least from Richard's presentations is you also had different sort of news anchors there and podcast readers and other actors. And I was sort of reminded of work by I think it's Mikkel Gherkin on how also there's a way in which misinformation can grow by, for example, one of the practices that we've had for a very long time, both on news as well as on podcasts, to have both views be present and to typically also give both views not just present, but also to give them equal space. And this sort of connects to this idea that I think many of us is value that many of us, at least in the Western world, grew up with. Like, there's always two sides to a story and etc. But by bringing that, there's two sides to a story into the space of the knowledge intermediaries, that actually led, or that's what he's theorized, to often people maybe giving more trust and credibility to perspectives that were very clearly minority or distorted perspectives. So I'm
Mhm.
also sort of wondering there's a way in which knowledge intermediaries, in their way of choosing how to display knowledge, may have a much more direct influence and may sometimes also cause us to be slightly less informed than we could be.
Yes, I mean, your article often focuses on the sort of, I would say, richer and sharper notions of what it means to be transparent. Transparency, you mentioned with respect to validity of measurements, with respect to traceability of results, and these sorts of things. What would you say, I mean, from this perspective, are the key factors that such intermediaries should be charged with? I mean, some of these things are very much for the researchers, right? And then some of them seem to be of more interest to the public. What are the key things that these intermediaries might participate in communicating?
There's something about the certainty of evidence where I think knowledge intermediaries have a key role. And as Hyde was also saying, there is this belief like, oh, if something is scientific or if something is peer reviewed, it is thus true. And I think there's still many of my undergrad students who think that, right? So that's not just the public, that applies to many more of us. And frankly, working in the Department of Method and Statistics, statistics are hard. Understanding odds ratios and probabilities is a horrible thing. But what I do think knowledge intermediaries can do, and what some of them also do, is using very sensible and intuitive analogies to illustrate that there really is uncertainty around a particular claim without using the same scientific language. So I feel that they have a role in translating and using sensible analogies to still embed that degree of uncertainty around it. And that would actually be a way of working much more transparently.
And finally, Hyde, how do you see this proposal that you give at the end? Although you're a theoretician, how do you see it playing out practically?
I like the knowledge intermediaries idea. I leave it very abstract to say, look, we have a problem of public understanding of science. Whether that's through communication tends to be a very common one. Philosophers say things like communicators need to remind the public how science works, things like that. Whether it's through more fundamental science education, or whether it's through these kind of knowledge intermediaries. I think that all of these will function quite nicely. In terms of just the two questions that were asked before, in terms of actually what these knowledge intermediaries are. One of the things I'd really put an emphasis on is institutions. So I specialize in trust in institutions. That's government, medicine, science, and public institutions specifically. Um, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that people put more credibility in information that comes from trusted institutions. And one of the reasons why we had a real problem during the pandemic was because we ended up with a crisis of trust in institutions. It wasn't just about scientists themselves, what scientists were saying on social media. It's the fact that you had formal institutions changing their guidance, that you had formal institutions saying one thing at one moment and another thing at the next moment. You had institutions in different countries over the world arguing and disagreeing with one another. Now, this is perfectly normal in science. We have scientific debate, evidence emerges, particularly during a pandemic, and opinions change. But the problem is the way that it was framed and the way that people understand science meant that when you see these trusted institutions, what they saw is flip-flopping. That then has quite serious impacts for trust in science, and then the kind of public health advice that those institutions are giving. So, in terms of what those intermediaries are and ought to be, I would put a lot more emphasis on institutions like state media, like the BBC, like official department communication. In fact, I submitted evidence just recently to a parliamentary select committee inquiry, and they were asking about the media environment, by which they meant social media. They meant misinformation on social media. There's a picture of Candace Owens up there. How do we deal with these kind of conservative commentators on YouTube and Instagram spewing their misinformation? And this is a standard view that policymakers have. This is a problem. How do we deal with it? And my submission to them said that you're actually far too worried about this group. This is a very small group with actually, relatively speaking, a very small following. Overwhelmingly, the evidence suggests that people are getting their public health advice and the trusted institutions from institutions. Individuals are really not, they don't have that much power to undermine trust in institutions. The power is within the institutions themselves. The problem is, particularly in our country, the UK had the most precipitous decline in trust in institutions during the pandemic. That was in large part due to Partygate, because the very institution that has imposed these unpopular lockdown policies on the public is now breaching, in flagrant violation of their own policies. And so it really, I'd like to take a lot of emphasis off of, these more minor individual personal actors. I would definitely urge policymakers to move away from policies like controlling misinformation and restricting free speech and things like that, and urge them to focus a lot more on the institutions and the way that they're communicating and educating the public about science, and particularly things like scientific uncertainty.
Great. So we're in the last 2 minutes here. I thought it would be nice to just have a few concluding remarks from each of you. So let's say, in a nutshell, what's the take home on trust and transparency in science? The provocative title of Hyde's article, and indeed of this session, suggests that someone, if you just read that, you might think, oh, we shouldn't be transparent, in effect, because it reduces trust. But that's not what's been said today. How would you guys put it in a nutshell? We'll start with you, Tamron.
I'm going to build on Hyde's final point and say that institutions can do a lot more to make it easy and normative for all of us to do our work in a transparent and rigorous manner.
And Richard.
Great. And so I think one of the really interesting thing from Hyde's articles is that trying to start with where the public are at, rather than where science should be, and trying to make science and transparency serve the public in a way that is useful to them. And I think that one thing that's really important is that there's a huge amount of diversity amongst the public. And so we need actors that are dynamic, that are fluid, that can respond to specific concerns in a way that a one size fits all with, say, expert consensus or a general education would struggle to do.
And finally, Hyde.
I'd say that the key message is that science is part of society. Often, when we are trying to increase trust in science, but in institutions more generally, we look at ministerial propriety, like public service ethics, to increase trust in government. We look at scientific integrity and open science to increase trust in science. We focus too much on the institution itself without really thinking about the society in which it's actually embedded. And we need to start thinking about those broader relationships if we're not just to increase the trustworthiness of things like science, medicine, and government, but to actually increase public trust in these institutions as well.
Well, thank you to everyone in this call for coming, and a special thanks to all of our panelists today. We hope everyone will join us at other festival events and check out the YouTube channel where this video and other such videos will appear on the LSE Library's YouTube channel. Thanks everyone for coming, and we'll see you next time.